Welcome back to Science versus Conspiracy over coffee. I am your host, Conspiracy. Science is off on assignment this week. Brew some coffee, pull up a chair, and open your mind. Today on Science versus Conspiracy over coffee, we will be discussing DNA privacy with special guest Sue Sullivan. Sue Sullivan is the daughter of an adopted man and became interested in family history about 13 years ago. She jumped onto the DNA bandwagon early, began a journey to discover her biological parents. Sue learned DNA family solving techniques and methodologies from the best, Blaine Bettinger and C.C. Moore. Today, she has solved more than 24 non-parental events. Along with sorting DNA, she also creates legacy keepsake posters and books, artistically connecting you to your family history. Okay, so welcome to the show.
Thanks.
We're going to talk about DNA and genealogy and kind of the privacy issues surrounding that. So in recent years, genealogy and family tree production and research has gained a lot of popularity through companies like 23andMe, ancestry.com, and a bunch of other ones. But what sparked your interest? What got you interested in it?
I remember when I was 16, I used to always have a summer project. And the year that I was 15 or 16, my mom was into genealogy, and we decided to map out Robert Brody, as there was many of them in the cemeteries that we were visiting. We wanted to figure out how they all related to each other. And then I've always just sort of had general interest. There were always lots of family heirlooms and artifacts in the house where I was growing up. And then, it's a bit of a funny story, but in 2010, Ancestry had been running those commercials about if you wore lederhosen or a kilt or whatever. And I could tell by the look of my husband's face that he was totally not into it, very uninterested. And he decided in 2010, in September, to go on a 3-week motorcycle ride and leave me at home. The first thing on my agenda was to declutter the house for once and for all, where he wasn't, looking over my shoulder at what was going on. And that lasted all of about an hour. And a commercial came on the TV, which was playing in the background, and it was Ancestry. And I went, oh, yeah, I really wanted to do that. Oh, now is the time. And so I pulled out a laptop and logged in for a free 14-day thing at Ancestry. And that was at 1:00 in the afternoon on Saturday. And sometime later, I didn't think it was that much later, I had 3 cats at the time, and they were circling me, and nudging me and talking at me. And I'm just like, what is your problem? And I looked up, and it was 9:00 on Sunday morning.
Oh, wow.
So you
totally
could say
got lost in it.
I was totally, the bug had bit me. And then I just proceeded. I just started working with my mom's research. She passed to me later in the week when she knew that I was into it. She's like, yes. As most genealogists pray that somebody in the next generation or the generation after that will pick up where you left off, so that their research is not lost to the wind. And so she was very excited and handed over a couple of boxes. And my dad was adopted. It was never a secret. It was my grandmother used to tell about his birth story all the time. But in Quebec was one of the last provinces to hold out adoption record information. So there was probably no hope of ever getting it. He was born in 1936, and he died at 40 years of age in 1976. This was 2010. So I wasn't holding out hopes. I knew that the only way to finding out my genealogical or biological history was to get into his adoption records, and that DNA was more than likely the only route.
Right. So then when Ancestry came along, then you were able to get access to all kinds of information that you wouldn't necessarily been able to find.
Yes, no, maybe, because They certainly don't publish adoption records. There's no databases that link to that. But in 2012, they offered what they call a direct-to-consumer DNA testing kit at a very reasonable price for the first time ever. Previously, DNA cost $500 or $1,000. Like many things, once technology grabs hold of it, it gets less expensive to do. So I tested in 2012. The results, I did not understand what I was looking at, honestly. And so mostly I would let it sit there. I'd look at the results and review them from time to time, but I didn't really get into it until the summer of 2015 when I met, I was at a dinner thing and the guest speaker was Blaine Bettinger. And there was also several day courses at this conference offered by C.C. Moore, who are two of the most prevalent DNA scientists in North America, probably the world.
Oh, wow.
So that gave me new things to study, like how to look at stuff and understand it.
Right. So I guess the results that you get back from these companies isn't as straightforward as line by line, easily understood. You have to kind of decode it in a way.
And what I found is when people do DNA, there's usually a reason behind it. They may not even consciously know what the reason is. I just want to know if I wear later I was going to tell. And but they have a question, and I didn't really realize what my question was until years down the road. And my question wasn't like, who were my father's parents? It was, who are my father's biological parents and my grandparents? Is it possible for me to find out this information? Like, you have to really look at it. Because unless your half sibling or parent actually goes and does a test, if you are a person who's adopted or unknown identity, you won't know. It's not that easy.
Right. It's still,
there's a lot of science.
Yeah. So the missing pieces still have to be put in place. It's not just you can do the test and then all of a sudden you have the results for all the way back.
Well, that's what I thought, all I have to do is spit in this tube. It's like a teaspoon of spit, which looks like a lot more. And you send it in, and 8 weeks later, if you're in Canada, when you do your spit test, your test goes to Ireland for processing. So it does take time. And sometimes they get lost in the mail. And you get back people who match you, who have segments of DNA spread over 22 chromosomes. Ancestry, which is who I first tested with, doesn't cover the 23rd. They don't do any what we call X analysis. It's not separate. And I mean, you get a name, could be a real name, could be a made up name, could be a pseudonym or a handle. I use a handle, but it's not that difficult. You could Google my handle and figure out from another of other platforms who belongs to that handle, because I had no interest in actually being private. I was all about being public. So I approached it from a different angle that way.
Right. So that the 23 part, is that where the 23andMe comes from then, I guess?
23andMe does do the analysis, if you're a woman, it does your MT DNA analysis. And if you're a man, it does your X. Probably it does both.
Right.
It does your MT, which is your X, and it does the Y, which is your Y.
That's interesting, because I didn't really. I thought maybe the 23. I thought it was just like an age thing, not.
Oh.
I don't know why it just all.
Chromosomes. No, I know. Gotcha. If you don't know and you're not in that world, how are you gonna?
Yeah, so that makes way more sense now. What that represents. So I guess what's the process? Excuse me. What's the process that someone would have to go through in order to get their DNA?
So they would have to purchase a kit, which is not like purchasing a paternal test at the drugstore.
Okay.
or whatever lawyers provide for doing paternity tests. And I should have brought up the kit with me anyway. So you get a kit. It's about this big. It's a box, and it's got a tube in it. It's got some really, really simple instructions. Ancestry and 23andMe do what's called a spit test, where you have a little tube with a little cup on the end. You spit, and you have to get it above a certain line. Most people, when they spit, have bubbles. So you have to get it so that the bubbles are above the line. This is a big deal. I also most kits advise no drink or food 30 minutes prior to making your test.
Okay.
So if you're having trouble getting the saliva going, it's not like you can drink some water and swoosh it around to make extra. It doesn't work that way. But I always encourage people, while they're, thinking about gathering their saliva, to take their tongue and actually scrape the inside of their cheeks, because that's what we need. So you can getting that, because that's what counts. Some tests do fail, and they will send you another test and, review all the good ideas and bad ideas. And I have had a few fail on me for no particular reason. I had a test that it looked like it was mostly coffee, because the fellow had his coffee and started spitting, and it was all brown spit.
Oh no!
And his worked perfectly. So
weird.
You never know. With family tree DNA, which is called FTDNA in shorthand, and family tree and MyHeritage do a swab. So you get, you've seen it on TV where they swab you see if you're the criminal. And you literally have something that looks similar to a Q-tip, and you're rubbing the insides of your cheek basically for a specific amount of time, and then you put it into a thing with a stabilizing solution. They all have a stabilizing solution.
Okay.
Yeah, so they have a stabilizing solution. You seal it up. In the case of Ancestry, it goes, because that's what I remember the most, you do goes into a bag, which has also a little one of those little drying bags as well, to make sure that nothing happens to it. So you've got stabilizer, a little drying thing, and a bag to seal it in, another envelope to seal it in, and then you put it back in the box that they've included in the kit, which is a postage paid little box. And then you seal that up and you toss it in the mail. And that's it. Living DNA does swab as well. And swab is good because as people get older, a lot of people have trouble spitting. So we tested my girlfriend's father when he was in his 90s, and he basically had no teeth left in his head. And he understood what we were doing. We talked to him about it. His grandfather was unknown to him. His father was raised by his grandmother with the aid of the paternal component.
Right.
And so we've been searching a long time. I have my suspicions who he might be, but it all happened a long time ago. And so before he put his teeth in for the day, we swabbed the inside of his cheeks. It was the only way to do it. Since he's done it, Living DNA allows you, I think all of them allow you to download your raw DNA so you can move it elsewhere. Ancestry and 23andMe do not allow uploads. But Family Tree, MyHeritage, GEDmatch, Living DNA, and a handful of other DNA type companies that don't specifically do testing allow you to upload what's called your raw data, which is just ones and zeros.
So with all this raw data, what can you actually learn from any one of these companies? Like, how do you piece it together? I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at here. You have your DNA, and then what?
And they all offer something a little bit different. Ancestry. So one of the big things that you may hear is chromosome browser. Ancestry does not have a chromosome browser. So, you frequently get Ancestry members belly aching about not having a chromosome browser. FTDNA has a chromosome browser. MyHeritage does, and 23andMe do, and GEDmatch does. And I guess maybe I can give you a quick cheat sheet.
Sure.
This will come. So Ancestry does not have a chromosome browser, but it has the opportunity to build trees. They have, tons, millions and millions of databases of records, which you can do searches on people's names for to assemble and put the components of a tree together. For instance, if you find a census record with a specific person, you're going to have whoever was living with them, be it a lodger, a spouse, children. It usually states whether they're married or widowed, and different censuses will reveal different things in the records. In Canada, we have a thing where most Canadian records are privatized and not available until they're 120. There's a 120-year threshold. So the 1931 census came out June 1st. And it was indexed by an AI bot within 3 days, and now it's being reviewed by humans.
Okay.
At Ancestry, when you get your DNA results, you plug in your name, a pseudonym, or whatever you want to be known as. You choose to be public or private. And they ask up front for your birth year and also the choice of whether or not to publicize that. And they ask for if you're male or female. And after that, they don't insist that you have a tree. Although if you're looking for people, the best way to do it is with a tree. The people with no trees are rarely helpful.
Even because why wouldn't you really be doing it if you weren't interested in finding family members?
Because people want to know if they're Swedish or if they're German, like where their origins are.
Okay.
And I will say that was one of the most exciting things for me in mid 2016. Ancestry brought out what they called genetic communities, and that was when I first learned, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that my father's parents must have both been French Canadian, because they told me specifically where in Quebec that genetic group, that I match a lot of other people who also are in that group. So that was very exciting to me to learn that I was 50% French Canadian.
Right.
The family tree DNA, they have a chromosome browser. So you can add a tree there. You can't build it there. They don't have records for that.
Okay.
You can add a tree, which is called a GEDCOM file, is the data format for that. You can upload it, or you can construct, 2 generations to 4 generations, whatever is your interest, or not do anything, which most people don't do anything. So it's more difficult. But with there, you can pick people. They'll show how many segments and how large they are that you match to. So you can select 5 or 7 people at the same time and look at them, and it brings up a chart and it says, well, none of you match on chromosome 1. Chromosome 2, you all seem to share this big chunk that lands here in the string. And it goes through there. So you can know who you're matching, like especially if you become familiar with what segments within you belong to which parent or grandparent, then you can honestly, a lot of that's really hardcore science. I did try to understand it quite a bit, and then I gave up on it. So I like my family trees. My family trees work really well for me.
Right.
At 23andMe, again, you can select, I think, 5 to 7 different people at 23andMe. 23andMe only shows the top 1,500 people that matched you. Ancestry shows everyone, but I don't know, 70,000 matches at Ancestry, and of course only the 1,500. So if my people who match me on my father's side test more at 23andMe than my mother's side, those 1,500 could kind of, which they have done, have buried my mom's matches.
Right.
Um,
Gotcha. So there's
yeah.
still a lot of investigating that you have to go
Oh,
through. It's just,
there's
it's,
tons. It took me
mhm.
6 years to even get remotely close. I had made it to my father's great grandparents. I had narrowed it down to them, but they had like 14 kids, and each of them had 14 kids. So it wasn't really as close as that sounds,
Mm-hmm.
and it took me 6 years to get there. It wasn't until I decided, had a girlfriend who was a nutritionist who just started running an app. She was from Pure Genomics. So if you do your DNA at 23andMe or at Ancestry, she can run your raw DNA through this Pure Genomics app and tell you which vitamins you likely need supplements for, because your body, your makeup, your chemistry just doesn't produce those things.
Mm-hmm.
So my Ancestry test was too old. So I tested at 23andMe for the first time in 2018,
Mm-hmm.
and was incredibly exciting because I had someone with an unusually high amount of DNA. So it turns out, so my dad's first cousin tested,
Mm-hmm.
and two of her children tested, and a niece of hers tested. And it was just a matter of messaging them and crossing my fingers that
And
they would
hoping.
message back, because all the platforms have messaging capabilities. And it's like an 80-20 rule. 20% of the people you message will answer you. The other 80% will not. And yeah. Anyways, I find it took about 30 days back and forth with the niece, who seemed to be the most interested. She couldn't even tell me who her grandfather was. She wasn't, I don't know, it's probably she's busy with a lot of other things. Just he was not in the picture anymore because he had passed. But she finally found something she had done in high school and took a picture of it and emailed it to me. And as soon as I saw it, I knew exactly how my dad's father fit into the situation.
Yeah, and that must be great, like a good feeling that, like, when you finally find that puzzle piece, the missing piece.
It's an unbelievable high. I just, prior to Father's Day, I have been working since 2017 trying to discover who my dad's brother's biological parents were. My dad's parents, who raised him, were unable, well, they had two children who both died within hours and minutes of childbirth, and they were not allowed, it was highly recommended that they don't try and have any more children themselves, so they adopted. And so my uncle was very curious when he heard what I was doing. So he tested and he shared the results with me and basically left it up to me to try and figure it out. In 2020, we figured out who his mother was. And then just in the first week of June, I figured out who his father was, and just like all of a sudden just started coming together, and I could see the pieces coming in, and I was like, and there was another person who had not done her DNA, but had done a lot of research on that particular tree. And she had a lot of photos, and there was a photo of the eldest boy in a family. There's 3 boys in the family, and the eldest boy was like an absolute dead ringer for my uncle, which was so cool. And I just, by dates and ages, I've eliminated the youngest brother, and it was sort of up in the air. Well, it still is up in the air, because a photo doesn't prove much other than that you belong to the family, not specifically the person. So it could be the eldest brother or the second eldest, but the woman who put the pictures up was a daughter of the second brother. So I didn't want to, I asked her if she would consider doing DNA testing, that I would pay for it. And she said, thank you. No, she's not interested. So we may never know that last component.
Right, but you can usually figure out, you've been able to figure out most of the pieces and kind of fill it in the blanks.
I know who his father's parents were. That I can say beyond a doubt.
So I guess that brings up the whole privacy issue then.
Yeah.
Because if you're able to find these people online through the different platforms and be able to message them, to try to connect with them to fill in
Yeah.
your piece of the puzzle. Other people are doing that too, obviously.
Yeah.
So how
And you have to
private?
remember, you're connecting with people that are maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 generations away from you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you go up a ladder to what we call a most common recent ancestor, and then down the other side on their side to see how you connect. So if you, Bob, and I are siblings, then it goes to figure that our parents are the same parents.
Right.
And if you and I are siblings, our parents are the same parents. If we're first cousins, it's our grandparents that we match at. If we're second
Okay.
cousins, we match at our great grandparents, and
Gotcha.
so on and so forth. So you have to build not only your own tree when you're looking,
Mm-hmm.
you have to also build the trees of your matches.
Right, and fill in the pieces.
Well, you have to see how
How they fill in.
my first goal is to segregate the matches into groups,
Mm-hmm.
where I can say, okay, this we'll call the pink group, this is going to be the green group. And there's different methods. You can do something called the leads method, which is just seeing who matches and shares with everyone else. And this, you build an Excel template, and if the world is a perfect day, then what happens is all your matches fall into 4 columns, each attributable to a grandparent.
Okay.
Because you have 4 grandparents. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes, I mean,
Mm-hmm. Ideally.
Ideally, that's right. And then you have to go about searching through the people that match in a specific column to see what are the common surnames.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to figure out how each of the people in the columns matches to each other. So you're building a massive spider web. And with the case of my father and with my uncle, or much worse with my uncle, the families were from a more isolated area in Quebec, and there was a massive amount of intermarriage between cousins.
Right.
Yeah, so it's hard to separate it out. And everyone that was coming in, the numbers, because you share centimorgans, that's
Okay.
the unit of measurement. Again, if you and I are siblings, we share
Mm-hmm.
roughly 2,500 centimorgans. If you're my son or my father,
Mm-hmm.
then we share about 3,400.
Okay.
And it gets less the more distant it goes. And by the time you get to 1,700,
Mm-hmm.
1,700 could be a first cousin, it could be a half sibling, it could be a great grandparent, a grandparent, or it could be a niece or a nephew. So you have to build the trees to figure out what generation, how you fit from this generation to this generation. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's when they're intermarried. I had a lot of matches in the between 175 and 225 centimorgans, which indicates a second cousin, except for because of the intermarriage, the DNA had doubled.
Oh, okay.
I was actually looking at 4th and 5th cousins. So yeah, it's enough to drive you cross-eyed.
Oh, yeah. Sounds like it. So a lot of this relies on other people,
Testing.
the testing, and the more people that
Yeah.
test, the better results everybody's going.
Yeah.
Matches
So
are going to be the bigger the
let me
database.
say too that
Mhm.
when you do test, you are only going to see the matches that you actually share DNA with. If you test Bob and I test and we are not
Mhm.
related to each other,
Mhm.
I am not going to see you, and I am not going to see any of your matches. I'm only going to see my own matches, only
Okay.
people that match to me. So, I mean, so there's a certain, and there's a rule of thumb as well with all trees,
Mhm.
that anyone who's living, who's marked as living, you can't see their name. It just says private. And you can't see anything. You can attach pictures to them and records to them, and they will not be visible to anyone else unless you have shared your tree and your DNA to somebody and you actually check the box. They can see private people.
So in a way, it's a lot like a social network. Like when you log on to Facebook, you can make your profile private, or you can open it up to anyone can search for it, or you can just share certain information with your closest friends,
Yeah,
type
and
of thing. Yeah.
sharing is a little bit different between DNA and actual family trees.
Okay.
Since family trees, there's records, and you can search by the names that you see and look for more records. I ended up building more extravagant trees for the people that have tested than they had. You know, and in most cases, and again, if they have a private tree, it doesn't matter if everyone in their tree is dead or alive. I cannot see it
Hmm.
without that person's permission. And the same thing with DNA. If you check off that you want all the private options,
Hmm.
even if I matched you as a sibling, I will not know that you were there. I will
Because you've
not know that you have tested. I have to ask you, have you tested? Would you test? Are you public? Are you private? You know,
right. So in terms of the privacy, that kind of sums it up for, um, I
regular
guess,
people.
regular people. But for the companies itself,
Yeah.
so
So
we,
here,
yeah.
there's two factors. There's
Hmm.
companies that sell what they call, what's the word that they use in my notes here? De-identified. De-identified data, which means they're selling or sharing to the purchaser, the ones and the zeros. Not
Hmm.
that the ones and the zeros belong to Sue or Bob. All you get is ones and zeros, which is great for researching for genetic diseases and predispositions and stuff like that, because the ones and zeros will tell you that you're 50% Irish and 20% English, and the rest is, miscellaneous European countries.
Hmm.
It doesn't tell you who the tester is. It probably, because they ask for, most of the companies ask for your birth year,
Hmm.
it probably will share how old the person is that belongs to the ones and zeros. And that's about it. Then there's the whole law side of it. So, because law enforcement has now learned over the years that they can use DNA too
Hmm.
to discover things. The biggest problem is CODIS, I believe, is the name of the international database for that. If the person has not committed a crime or has not supplied DNA, then they
Hmm.
won't be in CODIS. And this is a problem when they're hunting who serial killers are. They may know they've got DNA, and they can see they've got DNA from 5 different crime scenes that all match,
Hmm.
but they still don't know who the DNA belongs to, because that person has not done something that has placed them in the CODIS database. The CODIS database tests a very limited amount of markers to do its matching,
Okay.
as where the DNA companies test tens of thousands of markers,
Hmm.
thousands anyways of markers. So there's a lot more, there's more ones and zeros that they can use for matching and identifying. Family tree DNA does allow law enforcement. So there's one company called Pair Bond Labs, and there are other companies that can take the DNA that's been gathered at a crime scene,
Hmm.
and they can rerun it and reconfigure it so it will be in the same matching format as the direct to consumer DNA company, so that they can start seeing more and getting the sort of matches. You can't just take a DNA from CODIS and plug it into a DNA from Ancestry or Family Tree.
Hmm.
So Family Tree, if you as a spitter have given your swabber, have given your permission, then law enforcement is allowed in. They're usually questioned on the seriousness of the crime for
Hmm.
which, so it's not just, like if you robbed a convenience store and spit on the way, and they scoop that up and they know that that came from the guy that robbed it. Robbery is not good enough to
Okay.
get you to get you a ticket into the database. Usually they're looking for serial killers or criminals of just horrific crimes, where they have DNA, it's been sitting in evidence for 25, 30 years, or Jane and John Doe's, where again, there's something about the age of the DNA or the circumstances of how it was found that they really want to get closer to doing some identification. So first of all, that DNA has to be reconfigured to work with the direct companies. Family Tree will allow if they have to apply to be allowed to use into it. A JED match, you can opt into police stuff. And that's primarily when you hear a story out there that, we've solved, this guy killed 30 people or whatever. It's because Parabon Labs uses a platform called JED match. JED match doesn't do DNA testing, but they invite testers to download their raw DNA and upload it to there. Again, totally up to you. They identify it with a random, well, not random by their systems, I'm sure, a randomized number. So you have an ID number. It's totally up to you if you want to put your name with it. And it's totally up to you if you want to use an email. They don't have a messaging system. They actually provide the email that you provide. So a lot of people will go to Gmail, for instance, and get an anonymous-y sounding Gmail to put with an upload to GEDmatch. GEDmatch has a beyond excellent chromosome browser. It's now was owned by two guys, and it was sold a few years ago, and now they do a little bit more with it, which has got people a little flipped out. So they put in privacy things. You can see the symbols, what you've allowed your DNA to be used for or whatever. I'm all for it. I mean, even if you're my brother Bob and you turn out to be a serial killer, I'd rather the world find out about it and put you behind bars than say, no, you can't look at mine. But that's my stance. Not everyone feels that way. And I totally get that. But insurance companies all get, like most of the companies all share some amount of ones and zeros with pharmaceutical companies or medical companies for just looking at where diseases are happening and occurring and what backgrounds and makeup. 23andMe uses it, and they have a heavily worded opt-in system that's you can see. You're totally upfront. You know that you're sharing it for research purposes or not.
Right, and I think that's where my concerns come in is if I sign up for 23andMe, say, and I get a DNA test, and I'm happy with the level of privacy, and I check all the boxes and everything. Down the road, 23andMe gets sold to another larger company, pharmaceutical company, or an insurance company, or a holding company of something. Where's my private information being moved to, and how is it going to be rewritten? Am I still going to have access to it? Could I opt out of future company privacies?
You can opt out. You can delete your DNA, and you can change your name on the profiles at any time. And people do that. I see that happen, which is why, if you're on a hunt for somebody and you're looking for answers for some dire question, when you get a good match, the first thing is to go and screenshot everything, because if that person deletes that information, that you won't even have the tools that were available to you to work on. I think Family Tree and GEDmatch are the only people that let law enforcement upload stuff to. There's actually pretty explicit terms and conditions. There was a blog post from somebody last week how a law enforcement agency breached the contract at MyHeritage and uploaded something. So we'll have to wait and see how they're going to deal with that. In terms of information being sold to insurance companies or companies being sold and bought by somebody else, I suppose it's always possible. And I am not privileged to understand how they match their ones and zeros to their personnel profiles and stuff like that. So I suppose anything is possible. Is it likely? I don't know. Ancestry's making massive money. I can't see them walking away from it, you know.
Yeah, but like another larger company, everybody has a price. Every company has a price.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And just like for the insurance company side of things, if you test with any one of these companies, but then an insurance company gets their hands on your information, and you're genetically just positioned for some heart disease or something like that, then how do you?
Yeah, that theory came out of the U.S. Several years ago, probably close to 10 years ago. That was the first time that was proposed. Since that time, like, everyone's changed their terms and conditions, and you can dig deep into the terms and conditions to see what the, you know, if something's going to be sold or a company completely bought out, what's going to happen to it. And I think, like, if somebody bought that and changed that, you would delete your profile faster than you can even finish saying your name. So far, it was mostly just a scare tactic to get the people that are against DNA to not do it. I've talked to Blaine Betchinger about this. I've talked to other people. I've done all this research that I have in front of me with lots of highlights. And basically, the insurance companies are interested in segments of people. So maybe not you specifically, but if they can see that everyone who was born in your small town that you were born in keeps coming up with this botched up segment on chromosome 2, you know, then they may say, okay, you know, but again, they've still got it. They don't necessarily know where you're born, because when it's the information comes in is de-identified.
It's harder to, but yeah, there's got to be a key that could be sold. And
I know I have a first cousin who's a very private person. He's a high school teacher. So with some reasonable foundations, he is a little afraid of having his personal life more private, because teenagers are all crazy, as we know. And so I actually opened up his profile and called him the teacher, the being his first name and teacher being his last name. And I entered his father as father teacher and his mother as mother teacher. And I entered them both as alive, even though they are not. And then once you get to grandparent level, yes, there is information there. So, you know, if each of the grandparents had a few siblings, it would be somewhat difficult to figure it out. But you could, I mean, if you really wanted to be crazy person figuring all of that out, you could figure out who he was. But it's enough just to slow people down from that identity. I think I have not heard or I'm aware of a story of someone stealing a DNA profile for the purposes of stealing an identity. I don't know. I mean, crazy things happen in this world. There's lots of things that we can't foretell what's going to happen, because, you know, we're only 2023.
Right. Yeah. And I think these companies, they have good intentions, and on the surface, I'm curious and interested and for DNA testing and records looking back, so you can identify who you're related to. But then I get that part out of it, and then I start questioning and asking, what if right now for law enforcement, it's for serious crimes, and but who's to say that down the road, when you jaywalk or something, like how what's going to be the threshold today might not be the threshold tomorrow for
and as
for
soon
these
as
tests.
Terms and conditions change, you're emailed directly to say, hey, there's new terms and conditions. Click here to read them. This is the synopsis. This is all the wording, because people get really concerned, not so much at DNA, but in the family trees, you post pictures of your relatives, your ancestors who have passed, and other people can adopt those photos. If your tree is public, they can say, holy cow, I have never seen a picture of my great-great-grandmother, and here she is in living glory surrounded by her children. Yes, please save that to this person in my tree, and there are people that are making incorrect trees left, right, and center. I have on my mom's side, I have a branch of family, and 10 times that I've recorded, they married between first cousins. And one of them was actually worse than a first cousin. It's a much higher degree of consanguinity, and it was between an uncle and a niece.
Oh.
Yeah, we can understand. It sounds really creepy and awful, but when I look at the dates, I can understand how two people constantly meet at family things, and sure enough, fall in love, and there it is.
Yeah, so I guess you learn unexpected. There's sometimes something like that's unexpected.
Plus, like my mom's side is very well documented by me. I have a really good tree to lead people through the network of the intermarriages. And when I get DNA matches, my mom also did her DNA at the same time as I did, so that I could figure out, at least if someone matched my mom, then it was my mom's side. And if they didn't, it would be my dad's side. So I love my mother for doing that for me. And, but people turn up. And I had a message from somebody. I'm in your tree, and I'm trying to help my sister-in-law discover who her father was. She was raised by her mother, so it's not like there's even adoption records available for her. And she said, and I said, okay, well, let me look at that. And it took me, I think, 2 days to figure it out when that first happened. Now it wouldn't take me much more than about 10 minutes, but
right,
because I understand my DNA matches and trees and things a lot better now. But I was able to narrow it down to a family that had 5 sons. And that's as close as we've been able to get. I have messaged and done a lot of research to find out if there's any living people who are biologically related to those 5 men who would consider testing. And so far, I've not had any takers. I had a couple of people that said they would, but they're not even biologically connected because they were adopted.
Oh, wow.
We have a good idea who it was.
It'd be nice if you could finally solve that part.
Well, and it's kind of the same thing with my uncle. I have a good idea that it's one of the eldest 2 boys, and I'm not ready to disturb anyone's life. People at the other end of the stick take this very differently. I've been looking all my life to find out who my dad's biological people were. His brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles didn't even know he existed. So when I, send a letter to them, they're just like, what do you want?
Right.
Like there's a natural shock that leads them to think that you want money from them, or you want something else. I mean, the reality is, for me, they all live in the East. I live out here. I do not want to come for Sunday dinners there. It's going to be much too difficult. And that was actually the response that I got from the first cousin that I had reached, a different first cousin that I had reached out to. I looked for the genealogist in the family who I thought might be more understanding, and they were not. And it was she actually created a lot of trouble and had some information removed from a public website. So
that's so interesting, because to me that's so interesting and bizarre, because if you're the genealogist in your family and you're actively looking for family members, and then to put up those walls to outside people.
Adoption, I'm having a baby out of marriage was a horrible thing. And her reason for not connecting me with any of her cousins was they're too old. They won't understand. And I will be embarrassed and they will be embarrassed, and it will all be a terrible, horrible thing. So I sort of made a plan to put something out to the universe, and the universe answered me with other information. So I was pretty excited. As it turned out, my dad's parents actually got married after he was gone, and the laws were such for adoption that you couldn't recall your baby.
Oh.
Back then, now there's a lot more rights for the birth parents to be able to say, yes, you can have the baby for adoption. And 3 months later, when the baby's been in a home, they say, nope,
we want it back. I had no idea about that. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and then they'll be different in every state and every province and every country. But so they got married when my dad was 2 months old, and they had 8 more children. And when I finally connected with a first cousin to myself, he was like all for it, because he'd already discovered it in his father's side of the family. And this was from his mother's side of the family. And what we ended up doing was we created a private Facebook group. And he invited all of the immediate family that he knew, all of his aunts and uncles and first cousins. And I invited all of my immediate family, as well as all the cousins that I'd met and confirmed this with on Ancestry, all the DNA matches that I'd met through Ancestry. So it was interesting. So immediate family got to meet each other,
right,
as well as extended cousins. And it happened right at the beginning of the pandemic. So we had a good 2 solid years to just look at each other's posts and post things in this private book. And there's one aunt who's a little sore about the whole deal, and she won't acknowledge that I exist. There's a theory that she had a special thing with her dad, and this is ruining that memory for her. We're human. There's all kinds of personalities that make up the world. So people will react to things differently. Yep. Anyways, I did have a chance in 2021 for Thanksgiving. I went east and had Thanksgiving at my sister's house. And then my sister and I picked up a cousin that we'd met through this whole thing, who is connected to the family, who is bilingual. And she came with us, and we went to Sorel, and the cousin that I had met in Quebec had organized a little impromptu family reunion for 30 people at the Saint Hubert barbecue.
Oh, wow.
And we all got to have a meal together. We had 3 full tables of people, and we took up a corner of the restaurant. And I mean, we all had to prove that we had our vaccinations at that time and everything else. But even some first cousins to my dad came up to me and they said, we grew up with our first cousins and played with them, and we haven't connected with them since we married and had our own families. That connection has now been lost, and everyone was there at the dinner.
Wow.
And so there was like people crying, people, and I did a book about my dad's life, a photo storybook, and had it completely translated, and I brought that to give as gifts.
That's awesome.
To his family.
Wow. Yeah. Well, let's wrap this up.
I know I can talk for weeks on all of this stuff.
It's great. It's fascinating. My parents are my dad primarily is the one in our family, or my immediate family that's been working on the family tree for forever. He goes in spurts. It's like waves. He goes at it for a while and then doesn't touch it for a couple of years and then goes back at it. And
you have to walk. I haven't worked in my own tree for quite some time, and my tree is now at about 15,000 people.
Holy cow.
And that's because the French Canadians and the Scots for a time there were having massive families. So, and I connect, when I get a new DNA connection, I connect them into my tree. I do the whole path from them to how they connect to me. And that's why I end up with a lot of people in my tree. But I've got just a ton of amazing stories.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, so one last final question, and it's kind
Sure.
of off topic a little bit, but
Yeah.
on the show we talk a lot about coffee, and we drink a lot of coffee and a lot of different types of coffee. So if you were to have coffee or tea or whatever you do drink with a historical figure, who would it be? Or
Oh my
someone from
gosh.
your family tree?
Yeah, it would definitely be somebody from my family tree. I would opt for somebody that is what they call a fille de roi, or a pioneer in New France. Because there's some incredible short biographies that have been written about some of the people whose DNA lives within me. That
Hmm.
is, you know, just wild stories. Having fingernails pulled out by Indians, and fingers sawed off with a clamshell, if you can
Oh.
believe it, and still learning how to um, learn the language of the Indians who were his captors, that he had originally escaped from and came
Hmm.
back to rescue his friend who was a Jesuit. He
Wow.
was not a Jesuit, but he could not bear to leave his friend behind. And he ended up making friends and became a translator between the governments in New France and the Indian relations that he made.
Yeah.
Like, I'd love to say, hey man, like, how did you keep up the hope that you were going to get out of this, that you were going to survive all of this?
Hmm.
I don't know. I love stories about hope, perseverance, endurance, and knowing that those experiences were had by people whose DNA I share.
Hmm.
Just, gives me a lot of hope. When
Yeah.
we look around with our mortgage interest rates going up all the time, I'm just like, oh, how can I do this?
Yeah.
But I know, I have ancestors that went through pretty awful stuff, and others that wasn't necessarily awful, but they rose to places that they had not necessarily ever dreamed of and became leaders in communities and stuff like that. I'm just like, so many people I would love to talk to. It would be very difficult to pick one.
Right. Yeah, incredible
And as an
stories.
interest, I believe one of the research questions at 23andMe is about your love or hate of coffee.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I score really high on the coffee level.
Yeah. Oh, and I like my coffee too, but my husband does not drink it at all.
No? Oh.
He doesn't even do black tea. Everyone's different.
Yeah, everyone's different. How can our listeners get a hold of you?
They can have a website, Family Ancestries, spelled TREES.com, like those lovely plant life that drop leaves on your lawn in the fall. Familyancestries.com. You can also find me on Facebook at the same name, and on Instagram I'm under The Graphic Genealogist.
Perfect. Well, I'll leave the links to everything
Yeah.
in our show notes so people
And
can contact you if
yeah.
they want
And
to
my
find out more.
email is connected to all of those things. And I welcome anyone who wants to have you can book a free 20-minute chat with me, just to chat DNA, chat family tree, just chat about whatever you want.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, there you have it. I'll pass the conversation over to you now. What do you guys think about DNA privacy? Let me know if you've taken one of these home DNA tests. What concerns do you have? Let's discuss. Leave us a comment. If you like the video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. To hear more content like this, we release audio podcasts every Friday, and there's a new video every Wednesday. If you like the audio podcasts but not the ads, head over to Apple Podcasts. For $2 a month, you'll get access to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and early access to episodes. Join us next Friday when we sit down and chat with Richard Sugg, an author who has done extensive research into the psychic abilities of animals. Can't wait to bring you this episode. But for now, that's it for this week. But before we go, remember, being paranoid is smart. We'll see you next time. This has been a Story Monkey production.